The envelope came on a Thursday morning, tucked neatly into our mailbox like any other piece of routine correspondence. It was printed on stiff, glossy paper, sealed with the official emblem of the Homeowners Association, and addressed in a font so neat and mechanical that it gave off the air of a bill from a utility company. My wife retrieved it while I was pouring coffee and set it on the kitchen counter without a word. She had that familiar look in her eye, the one that said, "This will be interesting." When she finally slid it open with a butter knife, the first words she read made her laugh, a sharp, incredulous laugh that bounced off the walls. $5,500, she muttered, scanning the document with growing amusement. They've really lost their minds this time. The letter was written in stiff, legalistic jargon, as though the HOA had borrowed the services of a half-trained paralegal to give their pettiness some gravity. According to the notice, our property was in violation of community aesthetic standards on 2 counts. First, the small set of solar panels my wife had installed on the garage roof. And second, the arrangement of flowers in the beds lining our walkway. The panels, they claimed, clashed with the visual harmony of the neighborhood, and the flowers' bright bursts of wild color she had chosen specifically to attract bees and butterflies were deemed non-compliant with approved horticultural guidelines. For these grievous offenses, the HOA had imposed a fine of $5,500, payable within 30 days. My wife set the letter down and leaned back in her chair. Her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between amused and disgusted. "So let me get this straight," she said, half to herself and half to me. "They want over $5,000 because I planted flowers that actually look like flowers and installed solar panels that save us money. Credible." She picked the letter back up, folded it neatly along its creases, and slipped it back into the envelope. Then, without a flicker of hesitation, she dropped it into the trash can under the sink. "That's where it belongs," she said matter-of-factly. I admired her calm, though it wasn't surprising. My wife had spent years in the courtroom, facing down aggressive attorneys, obstinate litigants, and high-pressure cases that would have rattled most people. She didn't rattle. She was, by nature, unflappable. That composure had carried her through a career that demanded every ounce of poise and discipline. A letter from a homeowners association? That was less than a mosquito bite. It was an annoyance, sure, but not something that warranted even a wrinkle in her brow. But for Karen Miller, the president of the HOA and self-styled enforcer of community values, our lack of reaction was intolerable. Karen thrived on control. She was the kind of woman who treated every neighborhood barbecue as her campaign rally, every landscaping decision as a referendum on her leadership, and every homeowner as a potential subject to be brought under her authority. She wore her power like a crown, and the HOA clipboard was her scepter. For her, the fine wasn't just about solar panels or flowers. It was about obedience, about proving she could dictate the smallest details of her neighbors' lives. When my wife tossed the fine into the trash, Karen saw it as an act of rebellion. She came knocking 3 days later, just before sunset. The air was warm, golden light filtering across the cul-de-sac. When the sharp rap of her knuckles echoed against our front door, my wife answered, standing calmly in the doorway as Karen stood there with her usual accoutrements: a clipboard, a stack of papers, and that pinched expression that suggested she was perpetually unimpressed with the world. "You're in violation," Karen snapped without preamble. Or she flipped through her papers, brandishing one like a sheriff, flashing a warrant. "Solar panels are prohibited. Your landscaping is non-compliant. You've been fined accordingly." My wife listened patiently, arms folded across her chest, her expression as steady as a mountain. When Karen finally paused for breath, my wife tilted her head slightly and said, "Then sue me." The words were delivered with such quiet finality that Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. She sputtered, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, before finally huffing, "This isn't over." She spun on her heel and stomped away, her clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. That exchange might have been the end of it if Karen were capable of letting things go. But letting go wasn't in her nature. She thrived on escalation, on proving that she had the upper hand. And so, a week later, she went further. The morning was quiet, birds chirping, the hum of sprinklers in the distance, when a sharp wail of sirens shattered the calm. I stepped onto the porch just in time to see a patrol car turning into our street, its lights flashing in the early sun. Behind it, standing smugly at the curb with her arms crossed, was Karen. The officer who emerged from the car looked weary. The kind of man who'd already had a long day and didn't need this on his plate. Karen rushed over, speaking quickly, her hands gesturing wildly toward our house. She looked triumphant, as though she'd finally summoned the cavalry to enforce her will. The officer listened, nodded slowly, then walked up our driveway, toward the porch. Inside, my wife had already opened the door. She stood tall, calm, collected, watching the officer approach with the same measured expression she wore in court. He stopped a few feet away, cleared his throat, and said carefully, "Ma'am, we've received a complaint from the Homeowners Association regarding an unpaid fine I need to ask you about." And that was the moment everything shifted. Before he could finish, my wife reached into her pocket, pulled out a leather wallet embossed with the seal of the United States Courts, and flipped it open. The officer's eyes flicked down, and in an instant his demeanor changed. His words faltered, his jaw tightened, and his eyebrows shot up in recognition. He looked from the credentials back to my wife, and for a long beat he just stared. Silence said more than words could. From the curb, Karen was still talking, still gesturing, still certain that her authority was the only one that mattered. But the officer now knew what Karen didn't. The woman standing in front of him wasn't just another homeowner. She was a federal judge, and suddenly, the fine, the HOA's petty complaints, and Karen's crusade looked not just absurd, but dangerously close to harassment. The officer's hesitation stretched into silence, heavy enough to pull the air taut around us. He was still holding his notepad, but his pen hovered uselessly above the paper. His eyes were locked on the credentials in my wife's hand, the seal of the United States Courts gleaming in the sunlight. His lips parted, then closed again, as if he were carefully choosing whether to speak at all. Finally, he cleared his throat and asked softly, "Is this real?"
Ow.
His tone carried none of the officious bravado with which he had first approached. It was laced instead with caution, even respect. My wife's expression didn't waver. She had perfected this calm long ago, a composure honed in courtrooms where lives, fortunes, and futures hinged on her rulings. "Yes, officer," she said. "Evenly, it is real. I am a sitting federal judge, which means this fine you've been sent here to discuss is not only unenforceable in this context, but this entire exercise summoning law enforcement to intimidate a homeowner over a civil matter teeters dangerously close to harassment." The officer glanced back toward Karen, who was still stationed at the curb, arms folded, chin lifted, looking for all the world like a general awaiting the victory report from her soldier. She hadn't noticed the shift in tone, the way the air had thickened with something more serious than her petty vendetta. She called out, her voice sharp and insistent, "Well, what are you waiting for? Issue the citation. Tell her she has to comply." Her words only deepened the officer's discomfort. He turned back to my wife, still holding her credentials with a reverent care that suggested he fully understood the weight of what he was seeing. Slowly, he handed them back, straightening his posture as though acknowledging that he was no longer speaking to an ordinary resident, but to a figure of authority whose jurisdiction towered above his own. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steadier now, "with all due respect, this isn't a criminal matter. It's a civil dispute. There's no legal ground for police involvement here. Frankly, I shouldn't have even been dispatched for this." His eyes flicked toward Karen again, narrowing just slightly at that moment. Karen could no longer contain her impatience. She stormed up the driveway, her heels clicking furiously against the concrete, her clipboard flapping at her side. "Excuse me?" she snapped, inserting herself between the officer and my wife as though she were the true authority. "I am the president of this homeowners association, and I demand you enforce our bylaws. She is in violation, she owes fines, and you are obligated to support the community." The officer's expression hardened. He shifted slightly, positioning himself between Karen and my wife, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of protection. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you need to step back." This is not a law enforcement matter. And calling the police for this kind of issue is a misuse of emergency services. Karen blinked, clearly not expecting the rebuke. Her face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to salvage her authority. Misuse? Or dare? You. This is about order, about rules. If you refuse to act, then you're failing in your duty, Mrs. Miller. The officer's voice cut like a blade, low and unyielding. You've wasted police resources today? Do not call us again for a civil dispute, or you may find yourself facing consequences you haven't considered. For the first time since I had known her, Karen faltered. Her confidence cracked, her eyes darting between the officer and my wife, searching desperately for footing. But the ground had shifted beneath her entirely. The officer had drawn the line. My wife's calm presence underscored it. My wife stepped forward slightly, her voice quiet but carrying the kind of weight that needed no volume. Karen, I don't answer to you. Your fines are meaningless. Here, if you continue to harass me, if you continue to abuse your position, then the next time we meet, it won't be in a driveway. It will be in a courtroom. And I assure you, that is not a setting where you will find yourself comfortable. Karen's lips trembled, forming half-words that never quite emerged. The officer, sensing the moment had reached its peak, adjusted his cap and nodded toward us. Good day, ma'am, he said respectfully to my wife, before turning back to Karen with a final, pointed look. Ma'am, go home. The silence that followed was thick with humiliation. Karen turned on her heel, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest, and marched back toward her house without another word. Her retreat lacked the sharpness of her usual stride. It was slower, heavier, weighed down by the unmistakable sting of defeat. The officer lingered only long enough to offer my wife one more nod. Softer this time, almost apologetic. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I respect what you do, and I'm sorry you had to deal with this. With that, he returned to his patrol car, the red and blue lights flickering briefly before shutting off as he pulled away. As the last traces of the siren faded into the distance, my wife exhaled slowly, as though shedding the last remnants of Karen's intrusion. She turned to me with that same calm smile she had worn when she first tossed the fine into the trash. I told you, she said, slipping her credentials back into her pocket. Let them try. The neighborhood, however, wasn't silent. Curtains shifted in nearby windows, curious eyes peering out at the scene they had just witnessed. Word would spread quickly. Gossip traveled faster than wildfire on this street. Some would paint my wife as untouchable, others as intimidating. But no matter the narrative, the truth was unshakable. The HOA's queen had been dethroned in full view of her kingdom. That night, the flyers stopped. The late-night group chat messages grew quieter, and for the first time in weeks, our house stood in peace. The flowers bloomed undisturbed, the solar panels gleamed proudly in the morning sun, and Karen's clipboard remained conspicuously absent from our front step. But we both knew Karen, and silence, in her world, wasn't surrender. It was plotting.